Um, I think we're ready to get started. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chet Kerr. I'm on the board of the Irvington Historical Society and on the board of the Ardsley Park Property Owners Association. And I welcome everybody today to our talk about Cyrus Field, Amzi Barber, and the creation of Ardsley Park. We'll have a question and answer session at the end, but for the moment, I'm going to go through my presentation, and then we can, if you just save your questions or you can put them, we can raise them at the end, that would be great. Okay, thanks. So just make sure we're all set. Okay, so this is a map. We're going to start off. This is a map from 1926 of Ardsley Park as it existed then. But we're going to move back and start at the beginning. And this is one thing in terms of researching this project, was really fascinating to think about how Ardsley Park really fit into the whole idea of creating suburban living along the east shore of the Hudson River between Yonkers and Tarrytown. And there was an explosion of interest in suburban living at the time. And at that time, the Westchester County was the richest county in the country. And the town of Greenburgh was the richest town in all of the county of Westchester. And that was because there was a whole group of very, very successful people from New York who had discovered the eastern side of the Hudson River as a place to create summer estates and had been building large estates up and down between Yonkers and Tarrytown. And this quote, which is from the Real Estate Record and Builder's Guide, is something that I thought kind of sets the scene for today's talk. And let me just read it. It has begun to dawn upon New Yorkers that there's a section of territory at their very doors which has been too long neglected and which possesses all of the requirements for a fine resident locality for people of moderate means. It has been said that there are over 100 millionaires along the line of the Hudson River. This circumstance is not quoted because it is intended to convey the belief that a host of resident millionaires necessarily stamp a locality with a mark of perfection, but it goes so far to show that those who follow the lead of such a crowd of rich men cannot very well go astray. And I thought this was very telling because it reflects perhaps the mentality of the whole real estate boom at that time. And you still hear those same thought processes echoing today when, real estate people tell you about why you should move to one neighborhood or another. And it's a reflection that, people want to go where other people are, and they want to go to beautiful places, and they often will like to go to some place where perhaps very wealthy people are, because that really sounds very, very attractive. One second. So our focus today is going to be on Cyrus Field and Amzi Barber. On the left is a picture of Cyrus Field. This is probably from about 1880. I'm not exactly sure when this picture of Amzi Barber was taken, but these are both pretty remarkable men. And as you'll hear, they really, I think, seized their moment in time. They both, in very different fields and very different places, identified something, a new technology or a new issue that they decided to go after and take risks with, and were highly, highly successful in their endeavors in doing that. So let's start with Cyrus Field and his early days. He was born in 1819 in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, the 8th of 10 children. And he came from a fairly successful set of his family. His brother, Stephen Johnson Field, was a United States Supreme Court Justice, and another brother, Dudley David Field II, created the Field Code, which was a uniform civil code for the New York civil courts. And the Field Code is, if you're a lawyer, is a renowned, one of the first uniform civil codes in this country, and it's a very famous thing. And at the age of 16, he Cyrus Field moved to New York, left home, and started work as an errand boy for a small store called A.T. Stewart & Co. And that store was created by Alexander Turney Stewart in 1823. And when Field started as a clerk in 1835, it was still a single small store, as it remained for the 4.5 years that he worked there. In later years, Stewart built a much larger store along Broadway, and it's often thought that A.T. Stewart was kind of the cradle of the modern department store. After leaving A.T. Stewart, Field entered the wholesale paper business and ultimately started his own firm in the rag and waste paper business in New York City. He married Mary Bryan Stone in 1840, and they had 7 children. His firm was very successful. One of the first firms he joined, however, which was called E. Root and Co., failed. And Field, even though he was not a partner in the firm, made it his business to try to pay off the debts of that firm, which he did for about a 10-year period. And it's kind of a reflection of who Field was. He was, at least in his early days, seen as somebody of high integrity and feeling the obligation to step in and pay other people's debts. Because of his success in the paper industry, Field was able to retire from business in 1853 at the age of 34 and leave the paper business altogether. He went on a worldwide trip at that point with his family to Europe and elsewhere. And while he was, when he came back to the United States, Field was introduced to Prederick Newton Gisbomea, a Canadian engineer who had planned to connect St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador with the telegraphic system in the United States. And he was really struggling. He was having real difficulty doing this. And Field pulled together various business leaders that he knew and created what was called the Cable Cabinet. And he was very instrumental in leading the charge to lay and complete this cable running from the tip of Newfoundland back to the United States. This group of investors then created the Atlantic Cable Company to lay a cable across the Atlantic Ocean. And this venture was subsidized by both the British and the American governments. And Field ended up traveling back and forth from Europe multiple times to try to organize this, to get this venture going. And after several attempts, in the summer of 1858, a cable was successfully laid from Trinity Bay, Newfoundland to Volusia Island, Ireland. And the cable consisted of 7 copper wires covered with coats of something called gutta percha and wound with tarred hemp, and then covered with a sheath of iron wires. And it weighed about 1.1 tons per nautical mile. Interesting, to lay the cable, 2 ships left England, the USS Niagara and the HMS Agamemnon, and they sailed from England halfway across the ocean. And at that point, the 2 ships came together. They spliced the cable. One ship had half the cable, the other ship had the other half of the cable. They spliced the cable, and then the 2 ships went in opposite directions. One went back to Ireland, one went to Newfoundland. And ultimately, this was they were able to lay this cable, and the first transatlantic cable, the first message was between Queen Elizabeth, a message that she sent to President James Buchanan in Morse code. And because of the technology was very rudimentary at the time, her message, which was 98 words, took 16 and a half hours to transmit. And President Buchanan then wrote a reply of 143 words, which took 10 hours to transmit. And however, the cable, after 3 weeks, the cable failed. And so why did it fail? Well, it had to do with a dispute among the engineers that are working with Field. There was one of the big challenges of sending signals across a cable over thousands of miles like this was the inherent resistance in the metal to the signals going across, something that was called retardation or resistance. And there was a dispute over how to overcome this. And one of the engineers decided that the way to do it was to pump high voltage energy through the wire. And when he did that, it caused the wire insulation to fray, and that caused the cable to fail. So after having spent 2 or 3 years getting this thing laid, it only worked for 3 weeks, which was a disaster. And this is a map you'll see showing the route of the cable running from the southwest corner of Ireland to the Trinity Bay in Labrador. Okay, and then, so after several more attempts by this same group, they began a new effort in 1866, about 8 years later. And this time, Field took advantage of this great big ship called the SS Great Eastern, which was essentially the largest ship in the world at that time. It's a 22,500 ton steamship. And it was far ahead of its time and could, in fact, hold all of the cable that was necessary to lay across the ocean. And after several more attempts, they finally successfully laid in 1866 one cable from Ireland to Newfoundland. And basically the Great Eastern left Ireland, unraveled the cable, got to Newfoundland, and were able to connect it to the connections there, and then to the United States. This laying of the cable across the Atlantic was a tremendous worldwide recognized success. It was heralded as a singular achievement in both Europe and in the United States, because it allowed communications to effectively happen almost immediately, subject to the time that cost to go through the wires, rather than having to send mail by ships, which would take 5 or 6 days to get across. And Cyrus Field, who had led this effort, was given many awards, including a gold medal from the US Congress, and he won the grand prize at the International Exposition in Paris. He supposedly made over $6 million from his investment in the transatlantic cable, which would be worth about $100 million today. So through this effort, he was tremendously successful financially, and his name was known across the world. And he was seen as this remarkable inventor, adventurer, and incredibly skilled to pull together all the pieces that this needed to be done. So having had this great success, coming back to the United States, he and his wife, Mary Field, decided that they wanted to buy some kind of summer residence near New York City. And so at that time, as I said earlier, a number of very wealthy people had been buying land, essentially old farmland, that was being made into summer estates up in the area that's now Dobbs Ferry, Irvington, and Tarrytown. And in December 1868, Cyrus and Mary Field purchased slightly over 24 acres of property in the village of Irvington. And the property was on the east side of Broadway, between what is today Osceola Avenue and a point along Broadway just south of what is today Ardsley Avenue West. And it extended from Broadway east over the ridge that is today Field Terrace. And there was an existing mansion on the property that had been built by James A. Stewart, the president of the United States Trust Company. And so the Fields took that mansion as their summer estate. They called the mansion the Homestead, and they called their larger estate Ardsley, which was named after Field's family ancestral home in England. And this is a picture of the Field's home. This was published in 1896, though I think it was taken a number of years beforehand. And this is looking the driveway up to the home. It's probably looking north, so that's the south-facing side of the home. It was a very large, beautiful mansion, but not quite as ostentatious as we'll see other things that were created on his property. The family had a large mansion on Gramercy Park where they lived during the winter months, but they would come up here and reside up here in Irvington for the summer months with his family and kids. So after buying this 24 acres, they decided to expand their property, and just to the south of Cyrus Field's property was a 161-acre farm owned by the Stymus family, extending from the Hudson River to the Sawmill River. And the Stymus farm was right on the edge of what is today Irvington and Dobbs Ferry, mostly in Irvington. And in 1869, the Stymus family sold 20 acres of their farm on the west side of Broadway, between Broadway and the river, to Laura Beldenfield, who was Cyrus Field's niece. She was the daughter of David Dudley Field, Cyrus's older brother. At the same year, the Stymus family sold 55 acres of their farm on the east side of Broadway to Cyrus Field. And that part of the property was essentially where Ardsley Avenue East down to Roland, again, going out almost to the Sawmill River. The Stymus family had a long history in the area. Jasper Stymus had bought this farm in 1788 from the right after the Revolutionary War. There was a very famous apple called the Stymus apple that was developed on that farm. And over the next few years, the Fields bought more property to the east, going toward what is today Ardsley, and to the south, going down toward what is Ashford Avenue, and also which covered in northern Dobbs Ferry and southern Irvington. In 1874, Cyrus and Mary Field built a house and conveyed the property where the house was on the east side of Broadway to their oldest daughter, Mary Grace Field Lindley. And this began a practice where something that Cyrus and his wife, Mary Field, did for many, many years, essentially building homes for several of their children on their broad estate up here in Irvington, which they call Ardsley. Mary Grace Field Lindley's husband was David Allen Lindley, whose family had been missionaries in South Africa. David Lindley was born in Natal, South Africa, and he moved back to the United States when he was about 28 or so. His sister, Clara Louise Lindley, married Edward Morsefield, who was Cyrus Field's oldest son. So there was a double connection between the family. David Lindley ultimately formed a brokerage firm with Edward Morsefield, and we're going to hear more about that in later years. But they were in business, essentially in the commodities business, for many, many years. Stepping back, when Cyrus Field ran his paper business, his partner at the time was a man named Joseph Stone, who was Mary Stone's brother. And Joseph Stone and his wife had a young son named Frederick Stone, but they then died right around 1853, I believe. And when Frederick Stone was very small, very young, he was like 1 or 2 years old. And the Fields took in Frederick Stone and raised him as their child in their own family at their house in the city. And so in 1875, Field, as he had done with his daughter, purchased little over 6 acres for his son Frederick Stone on the ridge just to the east of what is Belmont Terrace today. So if you know Ardsley Park, the ridge where Field Terrace is and Belmont is the area just to the east of where Belmont Terrace was. Frederick and his wife, Margaret Stone, ultimately purchased a large parcel of property in Dobbs Ferry, just south of Ashford Avenue. And that's where they lived for many years. They were very large landowners, and he was a very successful person in his own right. Field then built this beautiful home called Inanda for his daughter, again, Mary Grace Lindley Field. And so Mary Grace, who had been living in this house right on Broadway, in 1878 moved to this new mansion, Inanda. And Inanda means pleasant place in Zulu. And it was the name of the village where David Lindley's family had lived while they were missionaries in South Africa. And on the left, you'll see a picture of Inanda as it existed in probably around 1880 or so, between 1880 and 1885. And on the right is a picture of Inanda today. It's a I've never been in the house, but it's a beautiful house up on Field Terrace. It's it still reflects its grandeur that it had when it was built by Field so many years ago. And when Mary Grace Finley moved out of the house that she had originally had on Broadway, Field's his daughter-in-law, Clara Lindley Field, the wife of Edward Field, moved into that house for a period of time. And Field continued to build other homes at Ardsley for children and for family members. So if actually the picture on the upper left, which is the gate leading into the Field estate at Ardsley, that gate was probably near where Osceola is today. And then the house in the lower left and upper right, those are two other houses that Fields built somewhere on his property for children or other family members. The picture in the bottom middle were the stables. These stables were, again, on the edge of the ridge that's near Field Terrace now, and he had gigantic stables up there. And then the lower right were kennels that he built because he had a large number of dogs and staff controlling those dogs. So those were kennels that were on his property as well. And he just seemed to want to build and kind of create this compound for all of his families in this Ardsley summer estate. And in 1881, Field's oldest son, Edward M. Field, builds Ardsley Towers. And this is a picture of Ardsley Towers. And this home was also up where Field Terrace is, just southeast of where Field's home was, and just north of Inanda. So it no longer exists. It's not been there for many years. But if you know where Inanda is, and this was about 100, 300, maybe 200 feet north of Inanda. And it was this incredibly gigantic and opulent and gorgeous home. It was owned, as I said, by Edward and Clara Fields. On the left is a picture of Clara Fields. And on the right is a picture of Edward Morris Field and Cyrus Field. I'm not exactly sure when these pictures were taken. But at the Historical Society, the dowel that Clara Field is holding, we have in our collection at the Historical Society. Cyrus Field and Mary Field ultimately conveyed the property where Ardsley Towers was built to Clara Lindley Field, Edward's wife. These are pictures inside Ardsley Tower, and I thought they're pretty incredible, just kind of showing the opulence and the wealth. The upper right is one of the bedrooms in the upper floors. The bottom lower left is either a sitting room or a living room. And then the pictures on the bottom right and upper left are different views of the main staircase. And you can see that the house was full of all kinds of art and this grand wooden staircases, which extended up 3 floors. It was a big, beautiful, luxurious home, and it reflected a little bit of how Edward Morris Field liked to live. He spent a lot of money and lived a very, very opulent lifestyle. So I'm going to switch gears just for a second to kind of put all this in context. While all this was going on, the Fields were building out their Ardsley estate, New York City itself was going through a real revolution. There was a growing population extending ever further north in the 1860s from lower Manhattan up into northern Manhattan. And New York City was struggling how to create a usable and effective rapid transit system. And interestingly, in 1860, there were plans floated for an underground railroad, but that was stalled and never didn't happen for another 30 years. But there was also a push to create an elevated railroad above the usual street traffic. And by 1872, there were 2 competing companies, the New York Elevated Railroad and the Gilbert Elevated Railroad. And on this map, the red line, if you can see it, that was a line for the New York Elevated Railroad. and the blue line was the line for the Gilbert Elevated Company. And these were very, building these elevated railroads was very contentious at the time because they were, took over large avenues, and trains were running over them that were coal burning trains, so spewing coal into the nearby tenement windows. And there was a lot of litigation over whether or not these companies were responsible for destroying the life of people along the streets where they were built. So they were seen as a fairly risky business. It had a lot of ups and downs. So this caught Cyrus Field's eye. And in 1877, he purchased a controlling interest in the New York Elevated Railroad Company and was elected president of the company. He convinced Samuel Tilden, who was a wealthy businessman and a former Democratic governor of New York, and the 1876 Democratic candidate for president, to purchase a portion of his stock to spread the risk. And the investment turned out to be a great financial success. Both Tilden and Field made a lot of money. There was a lot of demand for these services that these elevated trains were providing, because it really allowed workers to move and travel throughout New York City, largely through Manhattan, but ultimately into the Bronx as well, as a way of getting downtown to get into offices. In 1879, Cyrus Field got on a ship to go to Europe, and while he was on the ship, Tilden suddenly abruptly sold his stock, and that substantially deflated the value of the stock and caused Field to suffer large losses. And when he got to London and discovered this had happened, he was very, very angry. I don't think he ever talked to Tilden again. But because of the losses, he then enlisted the help of two individuals, Jay Gould and Russell Sage, who frankly are two of the greatest robber barons of the 19th century, who agreed to begin invest in the elevated railroads of New York City. And that was a fairly momentous thing, as we'll see later on, because Jay Gould and Russell Sage were renowned for being incredibly aggressive and not entirely honest, and they reflected a lot of the scourge of what Wall Street was in the late 1800s. And as many of you know, Jay Gould owned Lyndhurst in Tarrytown, and he also owned some New York City papers, including the New York World, which he would use to his advantage. Interesting, in 1881, there was a lot of tension going on between the elevated train systems. At that time, there were three different companies, and they were each competing. And Jay Gould, Russell Sage, and Field together ended up manipulating the stock of all three companies, and then eventually taking it over and getting complete control over all the elevated companies. And what's interesting here is it allowed Cyrus Field to see himself as kind of a master of Wall Street. He was kind of saw himself in his association with Gould and Sage, who as be able to move and shape markets and kind of do his bidding as he wished. And that ultimately, as we will see, led to his downfall to some extent. But it's a sea change from the perception of what he was seen to be when he was building the cable system back in the 1860s. Then he was perceived as being above reproach, completely honest, completely straightforward. And unfortunately, when he got involved with Jay Gould and Russell Sage, that patina started to wear off, and he was seen as more of a both investor and a speculator on Wall Street. About this time in 1882, Field decides to begin to purchase large tracts of land near his estate in Ardsley, along the Sawmill River, both land east of his Ardsley estate and north of his Ardsley estate. And he had plans to build a number of small but comfortable houses for working men. And he had the proposal that these homes should each be surrounded by a plot of ground, and rent would be relatively low, from $10 to $20 a month for the house and land. And what is really interesting is this vision of as he called them, working men having a house where he actually they had a plot of land and not just row houses next to each other, how the way a lot of suburbans were being designed for the working class. Again, reflected his vision of what new suburbia could be like, even for people who may not be as wealthy as he was, but who wanted some open area around their homes. And so this was his grand vision. He ended up making purchases that extended from his property in Ardsley Park south to Ashford Avenue, north to what is today Harriman Road, and east over to and beyond the Sawmill River. He ultimately purchased over 600 acres, but the planning and initial construction of this new working class suburb was stalled because right at that time, the New Croton Aqueduct was being developed, and which would run down essentially through the same area. And because the need to plan for that, he never got his project off the ground. In 1866, however, he was still looking to expand his Ardsley estate. And he purchased 35 acres in the west side of Broadway that included Nuits, the Italianate revival mansion that had been built by Francis Cottenet in 1853. And Cottenet, who had run a very successful import and export business, had lived there between 1853 until he died in 1884. After his death, his property was subject to foreclosure, and it was purchased by the Mutual Life Insurance Company, and that's who sold it to Field. Field kind of swept in and got it. The Nuits, this is a picture of Nuits. It was designed by the German architect Delfelt Lenoir and was named after Cottenet's birthplace in Nuits Saint George in France. It is, as people know, it still exists on Clinton Avenue, Clinton Place, excuse me, right near the Hudson House. It's a beautiful, beautiful home, and it has actually been largely renovated by its current owner. And I've never been inside of it, but it's supposed to be just a stunning, stunning residence. So that brings us to 1887. And what I call the tribulation of Cyrus. And that is actually a newspaper article at the time. As I said, Cyrus Field saw himself as a player in Wall Street who could stay a step ahead of the everyday investor. And he more and more had been speculating in the markets. And at that time, many of the markets were more split. They were not regulated at all. And it was pretty much the wild, wild west. And in early 1887, Field was speculating in the commodities market. And he was actually working with his son's commodities firm called Field, Lindley and Weikers. But on June 14th, 1887, the wheat market in Chicago collapsed. And it caused Field to suffer substantial losses over the course of the day. And Field's partners, Jay Gould and Russell Sage, quickly realized that because he had borrowed heavily to purchase much of his Manhattan Elevated Railroad stock, Field was suddenly overextended. And when the market opened about a week later on June 24th, 1887, there was suddenly all these press rumors suggesting that Jay Gould had died, that Russell Sage was hiding in his office, that Gould had never paid for his stock in Manhattan Elevated. And it was pretty clear that someone was spreading rumors to short the stock of Manhattan Elevated. And panic quickly spread across Wall Street because, again, these rumors would catch fire, and suddenly people were concerned that Manhattan Elevated and its shareholders were exposed and it would collapse. And in fact, in the first 10 minutes of trading on June 24th, the Manhattan Elevated Railroad stock lost almost a third of its value, leaving Cyrus Field heavily exposed. And as a friend and as a partner, Jay Gould called up, reached out to Fields and said, I could step in and I'll offer to buy your stock at a deep discount. And Field was forced to sell at a great loss. Lo and behold, after Field sold, at the end of the day, the Manhattan Elevated Railroad stock had regained most of its value, but Field had lost most of its net worth. And on the right-hand side, you'll see an article from the New York Times from June 25th, 1887, and almost kind of prestaging that everybody knew that Jay Gould and Russell Sage were setting the scene for cleaning out Cyrus Field. Everybody kind of knew it was inevitably going to happen. And the newspapers were all full of stories about how Cyrus Field just got taken to the cleaners by his supposed partners who cleaned him out. As a result of these financial setbacks, Field was forced to sell most of his Ardsley estate. And on August 26, 1887, Field sold all of his property on the west side of Broadway in Irvington to John Jacob Astor III. And this included the Newitz mansion. At the same time, Field sold his property, his niece, Laura Belden Field, also sold her property to John Jacob Astor. And Cyrus Field's property was essentially extending from Broadway, bordered on the north by what is today Ardsley Avenue Ardsley Avenue West, down to where today the Hudson House is. Laura Belden's property was the northern part of what today is the Mercy campus along Hudson Avenue, and then essentially where the tennis courts are for the country club today. And so John Jacob Astor bought all this up. He was an American financier, a philanthropist, and a soldier during the Civil War. And his grandfather was the fur trader, John Astor. He was the wealthiest member of the Astor family in this generation, and he ultimately was the founder of the English branch of the family as well. When Cyrus sold this property, however, he insisted that a restricted covenant be included in the deed for the sale of Newitz. And this covenant and Field's insistence that this be added to the deed, as we'll hear, was crucial to the creation of Ardsley Park. Because a couple of things. Field, as consideration to getting John Jacob Astor to agree to this restriction on his property, which was all on the west side of Broadway, Field agreed that he would place the same restriction on all of Field's property, which was on the east side of Broadway. And if you read this covenant, and I won't read the whole thing, but it basically was set up to prevent Astor from developing any of the property that he was purchasing into any kind of factory, whether it's a brass foundry, a glue factory, a turpentine factory, a tanning factory. Couldn't have any theaters or opera houses, couldn't have breweries, distilleries, couldn't have a hospital, couldn't have a schoolhouse or any other public institutions. And clearly it was designed by Fields to keep the kind of bucolic setting that this whole area was, to keep it in that same form, in that same setting. And as we'll hear, this restricted covenant can largely be found probably for most of the deeds for the property that are in today Ardsley Park. And I live in Ardsley Park, and I went back, because I just do this, and I went back and traced my deed back, and this restriction still applies to my home. So I can't start a glue factory, unfortunately, but it was farsighted for Field to do this, and it's made the real difference for what is our neighborhoods are today. So Field was forced to sell off other parts of his Ardsley estate as well, again, because of the financial losses he has suffered. In September 1888, he sold off 11.5 acres of his property on the east side of Broadway. And this is the property that was today just north of Osceola, bordered on Broadway and then heading east. He sold it to Linda Dow's Cooksey, who was the daughter of David Dow's. And then in 1890, he sold 670 acres of his Ardsley estate to Charles Henry Butler. a lawyer who had previously developed large tracts of lands in Yonkers. And this little map shows the part of the property that Fields sold to the Ardsley Company. And the map is kind of turned on its side. So the top part of the map is east, the left part of the map is north. The line that cuts through the middle of it is the old New York and Northern Putnam line, which is the train that's no longer there. That's where the North and South County trails exist today. But as you can see, this property extended into what is the eastern part of today is Irvington, and deeply into what is today Ardsley. And Butler formed a company called the Ardsley Company to develop this property. And it was that company that formed many of the neighborhoods that make up Ardsley and the area around Woodlands Lake today. Fields and his children still held property in their estate of Ardsley, but they heavily mortgaged the remaining 200 acres, and including the Homestead, which was Fields' home, including Inanda, which was owned by Mary Grace Lindley, and Ardsley Towers, which was owned by Edward Morse Field. Those were all heavily mortgaged at the time. Interestingly, John Jacob Astor, a couple years after he bought Newitz, after he died in, I think, January of 1890, and shortly after his death, Newitz Mansion and the surrounding 43 acres were sold to Manhattan College. Manhattan College was founded in 1853 as the Academy of Holy Infancy by 5 French de La Salle Christian brothers. And the school had started in Manhattan, and it had moved its campus up to about 131st Street in Manhattan a number of years before, but was looking for a retreat where they could expand their campus. And when the opportunity came to buy Newitz, they saw this as this beautiful place along the Hudson River where they could create this bucolic type of campus setting for their university. Cyrus Field objected, however, saying that the university was a public institution and therefore barred by the restrictive covenant in its 1887 deed with John Jacob Astor. And the Manhattan College and the La Salle Christian brothers tried for a couple of years to convince Cyrus Field to change his mind. They ultimately offered to pay $20,000 to release this restriction on the property they had purchased, which is about $575,000 today, but Field refused. And he insisted that they couldn't build Manhattan College, and Manhattan College, therefore, did not build on this property. The last 5 years of Cyrus Field's life were very difficult. He died in July 1892. His wife died in about 7 months before, in November of 1891. And several days after his wife's death, his oldest son, Edward Field, was accused of fraud, and the brokerage firm that he had started with his brother-in-law, David Lindley, collapsed. And this was big news on Wall Street. And the New York Times, the New York Tribune had daily front page articles about this collapse of the firm and the fraud. And it turned out that Edward Field had been taking customers' securities that had been given to his firm to be held as custodian, and then reselling them or rehypothecating them. He also stole a substantial amount of money from his father, Cyrus Field. His family, when this all happened, which was right at the end of November of 1891, he was immediately diagnosed as potentially insane and suffering from melancholia, what the diagnosis was. But he was put in an institution in Tuckahoe and kind of tucked away. And there was a lot of press about the fact that his family had orchestrated this to prevent him from being held criminally responsible for what turned out to be this incredible fraud. Field was ultimately found to be insane and ended up living out his life in an insane asylum in upstate New York. Cyrus Field, having just lost his wife of 50 years and having his son brokerage collapse, And then his other son, Cyrus William Field, who was also a broker and had a seat on the New York Stock Exchange, had tremendous financial failures and lost all of his money. So Field continued to borrow based on all of his remaining assets to try to pay off Edward's creditors and the creditors of his youngest son, Cyrus Field. Litigation was brought against Cyrus Field himself, claiming that he had actually been an investor and therefore should be deemed to be a principal of Edward's firm and should be liable for that, but he was ultimately found not to be liable. Cyrus Field's other daughter, his older daughter, Alice Field, and as I said, both his son, both ended up being institutionalized in asylums. And Cyrus Field was largely penniless when he died. And for the last 2 years of his life, his expenses were largely paid by his friend, J.P. Morgan. It's kind of a sad end for what had been a very successful life, but it was due to these financial failures and the failures of his children that kind of led him to this. So 2 months after the death of Cyrus Field, his daughter-in-law, Clara Lindley Field, sold Ardsley Towers to Amzi Barber. Again, Clara Lindley Field was Edward Morris Field's wife. Edward had been declared insane. Clara Lindley Field basically disavowed Edward, and she sold Ardsley Towers to Amzi Barber. And Amzi Barber at that time was 49 years old. He purchased Ardsley Towers for about $10,000, plus the assumption of a $115,000 mortgage. And the deed for Ardsley Towers contained the same type of restrictive covenant that applied to the Newites property. So who was Amzi Barber? Amzi Barber was born in 1843 in Saxon River, Vermont, the son of a congregational minister. When he was still a child, his family moved to Ohio, where he grew up, and he went to Oberlin. And after graduating, he considered going into the ministry, and actually took a year where he was in the theological seminary at Oberlin. But at the invitation of General Otis Howard, one of the founders of Howard University, in 1868, Barber moved to Washington, D.C., and took a position as principal in the normal and preparatory department at Howard. General Howard had been the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, and through his church, a group of people had decided to put together and create Howard University in about 1863 or 64, actually I think 64, 65, as a way of providing training for freedmen, the newly released slaves. Barber was later named as a professor of natural philosophy and mathematics, and he actually served as the acting president of Howard University in the fall of 1872. Following the death of his first wife in 1871, however, Barber married Julia Langdon. And she was the daughter of John LeDroit Langdon, who was a successful real estate developer in New York. And that caught Barber's eye. And in late 1872, Barber resigned from his post at Harvard University to go into the real estate business with his brother-in-law, Andrew Langdon. And Barber and his brother-in-law, Andrew Langdon, purchased several tracts of land next to Howard University campus for about $50,000 and combined them to create LeDroit Park, a new suburban development that would be near but separate from Washington, D.C. It was just kind of about a half a mile or so north of the White House and the Capitol. And this is a map of LeDroit Park as they had planned it out. At the top of the map is north, and that is where Howard University the campus was. So kind of bordered on Howard, and it was designed to, the subdivision was consisting of 64 detached and semi-detached houses created by James McGill, who was a well-known architect at the time, and was constructed between 1873 and 1877. The subdivision was intended to be an all-white enclave, and it was marketed as a rural escape for the Washington elite. And Barber and Langdon put up a fence that separated this new white enclave from Howard University campus, which was just to the north. And that fence became a very volatile thing. The Howard University students would go tear the fence down, and they would then rebuild it again. And that became kind of an ongoing thing for many years. Finally, in 1893, a black barber whose name was Octavius Williams moved into the LaDroit neighborhood. And from that point till the end of World War I, the neighborhood was an integrated neighborhood. And then after World War I, essentially all the white residents of LaDroit Park moved out, and it became almost exclusively a black neighborhood in that part of Washington, D.C. Barber's real estate company later worked with another senator, Senator Sherman, to purchase the Stone Estate, and they developed Columbia Heights, an area just to the west of the Howard University, as another suburban area. Interestingly, during this time, Barber ended up going to law school. In 1877, he graduated from Columbian College, which was later George Washington University, and had an LLB. He became a member of the bar, but never practiced. He built himself a large home called Belmont in Washington, D.C., in the Columbia Heights neighborhood that he had developed. And it was called Belmont, which was the name of the town where his wife, Julia Barber, had grown up. And this house reflects something that we'll see later on in Ardsley Park. Barber's desire to live in large, luxurious homes. He named homes and areas that he lived in after connections to his family. As I said, his wife had grown up in Belmont, and that's what he named this mansion. And then this is the opportunity that Barber saw that really changed his life. In 1876, President Grant appointed a board of engineers from the United States Army to investigate how do we repave Pennsylvania Avenue. Pennsylvania Avenue, that obviously went by the White House and to the Capitol, was this dirt road, and it was very rutted, and Grant was very embarrassed about that and wanted it to be made into much more of a beautiful road that people think of it today. And the Army Board of Engineers recommended they lay down sheet asphalt. It would be constructed from asphalt from Trinidad Lake in Trinidad. And there was a lake in Trinidad called a pitch lake, which is one of the largest natural deposits of pitch asphalt in the world. And this is an image of local farmers mining that pitch asphalt from the lake. It was a natural lake that asphalt and pitch continued to bubble up. So it had like this endless supply of asphalt. Barber, who was again in the real estate business in Washington, D.C., quickly saw this as the future. And he realized that cities all across the country would be interested in paving their streets. And he quickly secured a franchise to take asphalt from the pitch lake in Trinidad. This part of his business grew, and in 1883, he formed the Barber Asphalt Company. And then he later bought out all the local asphalt farmers in Trinidad and secured a 42-year concession from the British government for the entire production of pitch lake. And over the next 7 years, between 1887 and about 1894, his companies laid 16 million yards of Trinidad asphalt pavement in 80 cities across the United States, making him one of the richest men in the country. And again, an example of Barber seeing an opportunity and risking things to take advantage of it and having wild success. He decided he wanted to move his asphalt company from Washington, D.C. to New York City because that was near the center of commerce. And in 1888, he purchased the old Kennard estate in the Grimes Hill section of Staten Island to use as a summer residence. And he used that for 4 years. He called it the Bellevue. But at the end of that 4 years, which was again in 1892, he suddenly became aware of the fact that Cyrus Field had died, and part of Cyrus Field's property in Irvington would be available. And that had much easier access to New York City. And that's when he and his family purchased Ardsley Towers from Clara Field, Edward Field's wife. And he purchased Ardsley Towers in Irvington to be his summer residence. Having taken over Ardsley Towers, Amzi Barber kind of launched a plan to develop the entire area along the Irvington and Dobbs Ferry border into a new exclusive community of homes centered around a golf course and club. And in 1895, he purchased from Cyrus Field's estate an additional 102 acres, which was all the land on the east side of Broadway that Field had owned at his death. And again, this conveyance, that 102 acres, is subject to the restrictions that were in that deed we saw before between Field and Astor. Again, meaning that all the property that Barber was now hoping to create into this new exclusive neighborhood were subject to all the same kinds of restrictions. Barber also purchased all the land that had been owned by Manhattan College on the west side of Broadway. That included the Newitz mansion, and that totaled 64 plus acres. He also purchased 22 acres under the Hudson River adjacent to this upland property, so he had control over that. In 1895, he then formed a syndicate of investors to create the Ardsley Casino. And that syndicate included Edwin Gould, who was Jay Gould's brother, Cyrus Field Judson, who was Cyrus Field's grandson, Philip Schuler, who owned the Nevis estate and was a relative of James Hamilton, General Samuel Thomas, who owned a large estate on the Dobbs Ferry Irvington border, which essentially where Mercy College is today. And then J.P. Morgan Jr., John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, essentially all of the major names of the wealthy business people of New York. And that summer, he retained the architectural firm of Trowbridge, Colt, and Livingston to draw up plans to create this new clubhouse with a dock house and a boathouse and a private railroad station that he was going to call Ardsley Park. Trowbridge Colt was a brand new architectural firm that started the year before, but it went on to do a lot of classical buildings in New York City. And this was one of their first big projects. And then in the end of 1895, the Ardsley Casino Company was incorporated specifically to acquire real estate and construct a club, building piers, housing, and stables in or near Irvington. And so in this time in 1890, early 1896, Barber conveyed some key parcels to Ardsley Casino to build this casino. And this is a map of what today, that curved line that you see there, that is what is Ardsley Avenue West. You see that where the casino is, that's essentially where Hudson House is today. And the area just to the west along the river was set aside to create a private railroad station and then build a dock beyond that. This was all part of what the new Ardsley Casino was going to be. He also, to develop Ardsley Park, he then formed the Lorena Company. And the Lorena Company was named after his daughter, who was Lorena Barber. And Barber transferred to this new company the substantial portions of the property he had acquired in Irvington and Dobbs Ferry. And again, this is the green text is from an early brochure for Ardsley on Hudson. And I'll just read it. The immediate tract known as Ardsley on Hudson has always been beautiful. It was chosen by its present owners, Lorena Company, because it's more than any other section of the Hudson, combined all the requisites of an ideal spot, which gentlemen of wealth might erect homes and be secure in the confidence they would always be free from the encroachment of unpleasant surroundings and conditions. And this echoes the quote I put up in our first slide about, again, what's the draw of suburbia and how do you think about suburbia and what brings people to it? And the Lorena Company also leased to the Ardsley Casino property on both the east and west side of Broadway for use as a golf course. And golf was a fairly new sport at this time. It was seen as a very fast-growing sport by the well-to-do, centered around country clubs that were being built throughout the country and in the New York area. So that was an amenity that was a big draw. And in 1897, Lorena Company built and sold its first homes in Ardsley Park. And the first two properties, one was sold to Isabel Judson, who was Cyrus Field's daughter, and that her home was on the corner of, you see the map, the vertical street there, that's actually Ardsley Avenue West, and Hancock Road, you'll see going across horizontally. And the property that was between Hancock and Croton Aqueduct bordered on Ardsley Avenue West. And then they also sold a lot to Allie Hancock Griffin, who was the wife of the senior vice president of the General Electric Company, and that was also along Hancock. And these properties were also sold subject to the same restrictive covenant that applied to John Jacob Astor. And that set the tone for all these properties to be subject to those restrictions. And at the same time, they were building out the Ardsley Casino. And the Ardsley Casino was described as a country club for millionaires. Rich men up the Hudson building a casino to be the headquarters of social pleasures. And it was kind of modeled after what was then the Newport Casino in Newport, Rhode Island, and also to a large club up in Tuxedo Park in New York. You have sleeping rooms, card and billiard rooms, stables. It would be surrounded by golf links, polo fields, and all kinds of outdoor pleasures. The grounds would have a private train station and a larger pier where the members could moor their yachts. And members would be limited in number and consist largely of what were called swells, who made up the very top tier of society. And interesting, the bylaws of the Ardsley Casino, under the bylaws, the president and vice president of the United States, the president's cabinet, the governor of New York, the mayor of New York, the general of the army, and the admiral of the navy were all honorary members of the club, whether they wanted to be or not. And as I said, part of the allure of this club was access to a new golf course that was being built. Even though it was originally called the Ardsley Casino, after about a year, they dropped that name and just called it the Ardsley Club. I don't know why they did that, but they decided that they weren't going to build, there originally some plans of building a hotel there. They didn't build the hotel and just called it the Ardsley Club as like a private country club. And this is an image of the Ardsley Club, probably in 1897 or so, and looking kind of northwest. The Hudson River is behind this building. So this essentially is where the Hudson House is today. It was a big, grand, beautiful building. This is the driveway from Broadway leading out to the Ardsley Country Club, Ardsley Club, essentially where Ardsley Avenue West starts today. It might have been a little bit north of that, but this beautiful tree-lined street that led to the club. And this is a picture of the train station and the club looking from the river. And you can see the clubhouse has that beautiful veranda out front where you could go out at the end of the day and look at the sun go down over the river. And this is an image from that veranda, again, showing the train station and the dock. And the dock was this beautiful, gigantic dock that was going to be used for members of the club to bring their yachts up from New York, and they could moor them here and come to the club. And this was a picture of the Ardsley stables that were built. This is now a two-person private home on Ardsley Avenue West. As you go down Ardsley Avenue West and you turn right to go around Hudson House, this house is on the right. It's a beautiful, beautiful home. But at that time, it was large stables. And as I said, one of the big draws of the club were the golf links, and they hired Willie Dunn, who was this famous Scottish golfer, to build and design the course. And the first year, he built the first 9 holes of the course, which were on the west side of Broadway. And the first 4 holes were played right along the river across these large ravines that were along the Hudson River. And the back 9 was built the following year on the east side of Broadway and what had been part of originally Cyrus Field's estate. And the entire course was designed and constructed ready for play by the spring of 1897. This is a map of the course. It's designed by Willie Dunn. And again, the Hudson River is on the left. And as you can see, the first 4 holes, you start the casino and you go south, and you have to hit your ball over a series of ravines to the green on 4, and then 5 goes back north, 6 and 7 go east, and then 7's right at Broadway. And then you cross Broadway to hole 8, and you play 8 through 16 on the east side of Broadway. The holes go up to the upper right on this map, which is what was called North Mountain, and that's up where the country club is today. And then you'd play back toward Broadway, and the final 2 holes, again, were on the west side of Broadway, heading back to the club. And these are some scenes from the links. The picture on the left is the 8th hole. So this would be on the east side of Broadway, and looking, it's probably at the green, the 8th green. And in the background, you see a hill that has a large home on it that was owned by the Van Burens. That was called South Mountain, and that's essentially where Myrtle Avenue is, and Washington Myrtle Avenue is. There's a hill there in Dobbs Ferry. And then the picture on the right is the old 16th. When this is looking west, the tree line on the right is essentially where Langdon Avenue is, and it's hitting toward Broadway from the ledge up on the terrace to essentially where Field Terrace is today. And then this is an image of the club after the tennis courts have been put in and the putting green was put in. It is, again, you see both women playing there. The club was well known for both allowing women to play golf and to play tennis at the time. It was very much a sport club. That was what it was. And in 1898, they actually were able to get the women's champion golf competition to come there. With the growing interest in golf, country clubs were competing fiercely to hold kind of these prestigious national tournaments. And in 1898, the United States Golf Association decided they'd hold a women's championship at Ardsley. And 61 of the best women golfers competed, and the tournament was won by this woman, Beatrix Hoyt, who's shown here in this picture. And she had previously won the championships in 1896 and 1897. She was criticized by a lot of male golfers because she would only use a half swing off the tee, but she was a very successful golfer, and she'd grown up in Westchester on a golf course and was well known. Now, even as they're developing Ardsley Park, Amzi Barber maintained a fairly large estate himself, and this is a map from about 1901 showing Amzi Barber's personal estate, and you'll see Roland Road and Broadway on the left. There's a street going off on the left of Broadway. That's what is today Ardsley Avenue West. And then there'd be a gatehouse that would lead to Ardsley Towers, which was Barber's home. And then just below that is Inanda. And then just to the upper left is the old Homestead, which had been Cyrus Field's home. And this is the gatehouse that Amzi Barber built leading to Ardsley Towers. Gatehouse was on Broadway. And this house is actually still in existence. It's on the corner of Ardsley Avenue East and Broadway. It's a beautiful old home. It's just lovely. In 1916, the Lorena company actually sold this to Edward Jaffrey, who was a member of the Ardsley Club and was the grandson of Edward Somerville Jaffrey, who was a close friend of Washington Irving's and had owned the Willowbrook estate right next to Sunnyside in the northern part of Irvington. Barber had a lot of interests. He was a big yachtsman, and he was a big member of the New York Yacht Club. That time, the biggest competition was who had the biggest, fanciest yachts among New York society. And when the Ardsley Casino was built, he owned the Sapphire, which is a 130-foot steam yacht. And he convinced the New York Yacht Club to designate the Ardsley Club dock as the New York Yacht Club Station number 9. And these stations were developed by the New York Yacht Club up and down the East Coast as kind of way stations for yacht club members who could stop. They could, get supplies. They could overnight there, and it was allowed for safe and convenient landings. And so, having the Ardsley docks seen as one of those stations was, again, a big coup for making the Ardsley Club this fabulous place, because its members, many of its members were part of the yacht club as well. And in 1903, Barber bought what was then the yacht called the Lorena. And the Lorena was built in England. It was over 300 feet long and was the first ocean-going yacht to be propelled by what were called Parson Marine steam turbines. It was, for many years, the fastest yacht in the world. Barber would moor it outside right on the Ardsley Club. And he would come down in the morning, get in the yacht and sail down to New York, and then sail back up at the end of the day. That was one of the ways he went back and forth from New York. He sailed this yacht all around the world. He was famous for taking 3 or 4 month cruises and taking people with him. It was a very, very luxurious way of traveling around the world. He was also interested in automobiles. In 1899, John Brisbane Walker, who was the publisher of Cosmopolitan magazine and a member of the Ardsley Club, signed a contract to purchase the Stanley Steamer Company for $250,000. Now, Walker had long been interested in horseless carriages and had written a number of articles about horseless carriages in his Cosmopolitan magazine after he bought it in the late 1800s. And he had actually staged one of the first road races as kind of a publicity stunt in 1896. He set up a race to have people drive their horseless carriage from the Cosmopolitan building in New York City up to the new Cosmopolitan magazine building in Irvington and back again. And about 25 horseless carriages participated. I think only 6 made it up back and forth. It was about a 26-mile trip. But that was the kind of way Walker was. And so he was really interested in the Stanley Steamer Company, decided to buy it, but he didn't really have the money. So he approached Barber and offered to sell him one half of the company if Barber put up all the money. Barber agreed, but after they purchased the company, they had a falling out almost immediately. And I think it was probably over which of their respective relatives would run the company. And they agreed to split it, and Walker opened a plant in Tarrytown to build the Mobile, which was his company. And Barber ultimately opened a plant in Bridgeport to build the Locomobile. And Barber put his son-in-law, Samuel Davis, as the treasurer and asked him to help run the company. And these are the images of early locomobiles. The one on the left is one of the first steam versions of the locomobile, essentially a Stanley steamer, but as billed as a locomobile. And the one on the right is a Type C, which was the first gasoline-powered locomobile. The first model they made, it was probably, I think, in about 1904, I think is when they made that. Actually, maybe a little bit later than that. And Locomobile continued on as a automobile company into the 20s when it was then sold off. Barber was no longer involved at that point, but it was a well-known early innovator of automobiles. So the Lorena Company was beginning to push the sale of lots at Ardsley Park, and they sold several lots on the northeast corner of Hancock Place and Hudson Avenue West. They sold a lot to Berkeley Sherwood Dunn on the south side of Hudson Avenue West, and you can still see that house. If you're driving up from the train station, Hudson Avenue West, there's a house that's now on the Mercy campus that almost touches the road. That was Dunn's home. And the same year, they sold this 4.5 acre lot on South Mountain, which just north of Myrtle Avenue, and to Maria Lavina Archibald Van Buren, who was a Standard Oil heiress and a very, very wealthy woman. She and her husband for many years had large properties up in Newport, but they maintained this house in Ardsley Park as well. And Edward Gould, who was Jay Gould's brother, purchased a large lot called the Hampton House, which was the entire block between Broadway, Roland, Erie, and Hudson. Herbert and Kara Carpenter purchased the Fairlight Cottage, which still exists at the corner of Bertha and Langdon here in Ardsley Park. It's a beautiful home. It's a gorgeous home. And then Harriet Harriman bought the Guilford House, which took up the entire block between Broadway, Hudson, Erie, and Langdon. The Hampton House and the Guilford House are no longer here, but as I said, the Fairlight Cottage is still here. And in each of these deeds, again, the Lorena Company imposed the same restrictions that the same restricted covenants. And they also started imposing a requirement that if you ever replaced your house, you had to do so by building a house that cost at least $8,000, about $270,000 today. And that was designed to ensure that the value of these homes would remain high. So in 1903, there was an outrageous scandal at the Ardsley Club. In May, John Hefferman, who was a coachman for the Ardsley Club member Max Sands, was shot by an assailant on the northern end of the club grounds. And it was during the evening, he was walking with this young woman named Sarah Campbell, who worked for the Irvington Institute in Terrytown, a boys' school in Terrytown. And he was shot right on the edge of the northern, right about where Ardsley Avenue West circles around Hudson House today. And after he was shot, a bunch of club members ran and took a door from the club, went up and picked him up, carried him back to the club, and he was taken to the hospital where he died. Sarah Campbell told the police that Hefferman had said that he had been shot by Hewitt's son-in-law. And a watchman at the club claimed that Hefferman said he'd been shot by Hewitt's intended son-in-law. And Hewitt was Robert Hewitt, who was this renowned member of the club. He lived on property along the Hudson just south of Clinton today, and very well known in social circles. And his son-in-law was the club member Edward Jaffrey, and his intended son-in-law, his son-in-law, and his intended son-in-law was Ruford Sewall of Boston. And Ruford Sewall's father was Arthur Sewall, who had been the vice presidential candidate for the Democratic Party in 1896 and was very high up in Boston society. So this story, when it broke, had everything. It had murder, the intrigue of this young woman, Sarah Campbell, and what was she doing there. It had money, had power and politics, and the papers ate it up. And for about a month, it was all over the New York Times, the New York Tribune, about the scandal and whether or not Edward Jaffrey and Rufus Sewall had somehow shot this Hefferman in some kind of jealous rage. And so there was a big inquest held here in White Plains, and the coroner Russell, called Campbell, the young woman, called Healy, who was the club manager, come and testify about what they heard Hefferman say. And Jaffrey and Sewell appeared to testify as well. And during the hearing, this very dramatic thing, Miss Campbell failed to identify either Jaffrey or Sewell as the shooter, and they were found not to be responsible. But it was, again, this gigantic society scandal that these guys were accused of this stuff in the grisly murder. Now, Lorena Company kept selling property, and in 1905, a lawyer named J. Allen Townsend built a large mansion just west of where Cyrus Field's old homestead would be. And this is essentially between Ardsley Avenue East and Osceola. And this is a picture of this house. This house is actually still here. It's probably about 50 yards to my right from where I sit in my house. He was a very well-known lawyer. And again, this house has continued to be here in our neighborhood. And this was the stables he built for his large house. And this is also now a private home along Osceola. It's a beautiful home as well. And at the time, there was a deed restriction that if he ever tore down these stables, he had to rebuild the stables for it that would cost at least $1,000. That was one of the restrictions in his deed. And the sale of lots accelerated on both the east and west side of Broadway. And this is a map created by the Lorena Company, the various properties. And this is between Clifton Avenue or Clifton Place, Hancock Place, and Ardsley Avenue West. And the Lorena Company was interesting. They did maps of almost all the properties they sold. So many of the lots that are now make up Ardsley Park, there's old traditional maps showing as they were originally drawn the properties and who was buying them. This is another house that was built on Clifton Place. It was sold to a guy named Daniel Bacon. And he was a shipping executive and one of the original members of the Ardsley Casino. And this is pictures of his house from Architecture, which is a magazine in 1909. And this house also still exists on Clifton Place. Again, it's a beautiful home there. And just an example of a lot of members of the Ardsley Club would, build these grand homes and then have them shown in architectural magazines. And again, much like you see sometimes today, these things don't change. After Barber's death, so Barber died in 1909, he died of pneumonia. And at the time, his daughter, Lorena Langdon Barber Davis, and his son-in-law, Samuel Todd Davis, who was the president of both the Lorena Company and actually the Locomobile Company, were living in Inanda. Over the next 5 years, the Lorena Company continued to sell parcels throughout Ardsley Park. And in the little picture here, that it's a little hard to see, but in the back left is Samuel Davis. To his right is his wife. In the front of the car is his daughter with the driver. Unfortunately, in 1915, Samuel Davis died of sudden food poisoning. And the following year, a syndicate led by John Havemeyer of Ardsley Park took over the Lorena Company from the Barber and Davis family. And that was pretty much the end of the Barber and Davis family's direct involvement in the Lorena Company. And so I'm going to end with a map of Ardsley Park in 1926. So this is about 30 years after Barber began developing the property. And you'll see that Ardsley Park extended both from where the casino is down by the river, way to the east. And that is that green area in the far right. That's essentially where the country club is today. That was called North Mountain. It extended north up to where Osceola Avenue is, and the green area, which is where Ardsley Towers was, at this point was still owned by Lorena Company. And it extended all the way down to Ashford Avenue, where part of the golf course originally was extended down there. It doesn't extend that far today. But it really reflects that, this whole vision and this idea of a new suburban enclave grew out of Cyrus Field's vision of what this had to be and the restrictions he put on it. And then Amzi Barber's view of what the world could be by building this new suburban community built around this very fancy club and this country club. So I want to end with an acknowledgement and a thank you to Lang Stevenson. Many of you know Lang. His great grandfather was Amzi Barber, and his family grew up in Inanda and in the Ardsley Towers. And he has been a longtime member of the Ardsley Country Club and was very involved in the book written by Kate Buford about the history of the Ardsley Country Club. And many of the images I've used today came out of Lang's original collection of photographs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing. And I see that there's a number of things in the chat, which I frankly have ignored as I've been talking. I apologize. But let me see if I can look at some of them. And if there's questions, I can see if I can answer them. So one of the first questions, when was Cyrus Field Road named? That was the road that leads from Harriman down to the Sawmill River Parkway. I think that was named, I believe, in about 1934, 35, when Harriman Road was rerouted around the reservoir. I think that's about it was, but not sure. What happened to Ardsley Towers? It was, I believe it ultimately was burned down, unfortunately, and then destroyed and then redeveloped. So now up on Field Terrace, where Ardsley Towers are, there's a series of homes, like 63 and 61 are up there. The area just north of Inanda, which is where Ardsley Towers was. And there's a question, some names included Morse, such as this relationship to Samuel B. Morse. Again, Field's son was named Edward Morse Field. I actually don't know whether or not Edward Morse Field was named after Samuel Morse. I don't know the answer to that question, but I can try to figure it out. Another question is, what happened to the original club on the water? Well, the Ardsley Club kind of was hit hard by the Depression. It actually went into bankruptcy in the late 1920s. What had been the old stables became the Ardsley Racket Club. And I think, right around 1930, members of the old Ardsley Club, when the club went bankrupt, had the option of going to become members of the Ardsley Racket Club. What had been the casino was torn down in the early 30s, and the Hudson House was built where that was, and where Hudson House is today is where the old casino was. I see up here that, let's see, is it possible? Was the Stymus family connected to Pottier and Stymus, renowned 19th century furniture makers? I believe they were. I believe that one of the Jasper Stymus's grandchildren, I believe, I'm not sure, grandsons, I'm not sure which one, is the Stymus of Pottier and Stymus's. I think they were both pottery makers and furniture makers. And I believe that's the case. I'd have to go back and confirm that. Let's see what other questions we have. What's your favorite part of the Ardsley Park and why? That's a little hard for me to say. I find all these interesting parts of history, and one of the benefits of being able to research all this stuff is, frankly, there's too much information here, and I've had to take what I've had and winnow it down to probably an hour and 20 minutes, which is, I could talk for hours about all this stuff. You guys all fall asleep. You don't want to do that. But it's a fascinating people, a fascinating social experiment, and the dynamics between, again, originally building this club for the swank, swells, and millionaires, and then thinking about it and expanding into a suburban draw for supposedly people of more moderate means. But what was drawing them here was the wealth. And so it's just a lot of interesting things up here that we could talk about. So one question is, how did Cyrus Field fall in with Jay Gould? I believe, I'm not exactly sure what tied him to Jay Gould. Jay Gould obviously lived in Lyndhurst, so he was a neighbor and was well known in business circles. I think that Jay Gould was a speculator on Wall Street, and when Field was challenged by Tilden, and things were put in risk, and the New York Elevated Railroad Company was put at risk, Jay Gould was somebody who was willing to step up and play the role. There's a question of whether David Dudley Field was Gould's lawyer, which David Dudley Field was Cyrus Field's older brother. I actually don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure. I don't know. There's a question here, was Tenant Hancock was first owned by Ms. Nesbitt. Was she a significant player in forming the club? I don't know off the top of my head. I can probably look that up and get back to you. I just don't remember off the top of my head. And then another question, do you know who originally lived in 43 Langdon? Again, I have it. I just don't have it at my fingertips. I apologize. What can I say? Are there any Stymus apple trees developed in Cyrus Field Farm still in Irvington? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. Again, there was a book written around the turn of the century, by I think the New York Agricultural Department of the state, about all the New York apples, and there's hundreds and hundreds of apples that were developed here in New York State. Whether or not the Stymus apple trees still exist and where they can be found, I don't know the answer to that. I'm just not sure. There's a question whether Field worked with Queen Victoria, and I think you may be right. If my slide said Queen Elizabeth, it was my error, but I think it was Queen Victoria who did that. I apologize if I made that error. There's a question about, how does Ardsley Park have its own post office? And people know that in the train station at Ardsley Park, there's a little post office. I actually don't know the history of how that was started, how long it's been there, but it's been there for many, many years. I know it's been there for at least the 25 years that I lived here. And but I don't know the origins of that. There's a question: how is the Schuler land north of Ardsley or Avenue West related to Nevis and the Hamiltons? Well, that land was originally owned by James Hamilton, who was married to, I think it was Elizabeth Schuler. So the Schuler family and the Hamilton families were very close and interrelated. And I believe Philip Schuler had inherited that from either James Hamilton or his son, Alexander Hamilton. That was my recollection, I believe. And I see a message that we lived at 55 Field Terrace for 15 years. We're told that a castle was destroyed where our pool was located, and that was Ardsley Towers. That's true. That's exactly where Ardsley Towers was. And there's a question about Native American communities were in the area prior, and I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, but it's the Weekasqueak was the local Indian tribe. They were part of Lenape tribes that lived right along here. They actually had a settlement at Wickers Creek, which is just south of the Mercy campus. But they were essentially pushed out by the Dutch in the 1600s. And when the Dutch took it over, and then this was all Phillips Manor and made into farms before the Revolutionary War. There's a number of other questions, but I think we have been going for about an hour and a half. And I will try, if people have additional questions, you can feel free to email me, and if I can answer them, I will. I want to be protective of people's time. I think Veronica Gedrich, who is the president of the Irvington Historical Society, wanted to say a few words as we end our session. So Veronica, go ahead.
Right. And thanks, Chet. That was so terrific. I know that people who have seen the presentation will want to re-see it, and those who have missed it will be delighted to see it. And it's being recorded, and it will be posted on our website. So that I think we'll all be grateful for that. What a wealth of information. Thank you all for joining us today. And if you've missed any of our programs, they are recent ones. They've been posted on our website, www.irvingtonhistoricalsociety.org. And speaking of our website,